afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's panel discussion, Household Workers Unite, a conversation between scholars and activists, which is a rare kind of event here in the Ivory Tower, and I want to tell you just a little bit about the genesis of this event, and then give our stellar panelists a much briefer introduction than they deserve, and then get out of the way of what I expect to be a discussion that will educate, inspire, and challenge us. Household Workers Unite takes its title from the important book by Premila Nadasen, Household Workers Unite, the untold story of African American women who built a movement. And at Radcliffe, we do not have events that sell books, so I'm going to show it to you so that you can find it readily in neighborhood bookstores, because I think you will want it after you hear about it and from its author. It's hard to overstate the novelty of Professor Nadasen's study. And in fact, when you look in the Harvard online catalog by its Library of Congress subject headings, there are no other histories of the domestic worker organizing movement. In her story, an untold story, ordinary domestic workers, maids, cooks, nannies, elder care volunteers, and other household technicians bond together to become not the victims who sometimes pop up in our headlines, but the heroes of their own lives and the founders of an important movement. As Nadasen points out, household workers had long remained on the margins of historical study and marginalized three ways: overlooked in histories of the African American freedom struggle, in histories of the women's movement, and in histories of the labor movement in the post-World War II era. In Nadasen's capable hands, the organizing efforts of household workers from the 1950s through the 1970s become a kind of hub that ties together these three major strands of 20th century history in a truly intersectional and revelatory way. Household Workers Unite reminds us that the home has long been a central theater of public combat, paeans to women's sphere or the separation of household and work to the contrary. So I'm the director of the Schlesinger Library, which is the premier library on the history of women in America. And it's obvious why our library would have an interest in such a pioneering study. But we also have a special relationship to Household Workers Unite, because important parts of Nadasen's research were nourished by our collection, as you'll be able to read about in this winter's issue of Radcliffe Magazine, where Professor Nadasen has written an article about her hunt for records of the silenced voices of often invisible actors in our national stories. Today's conversation uses Nadasen's book as a jumping off point for a discussion about the current generation of household labor organizing and its relationship to this long history. After Professor Nadasen makes some brief framing remarks, we'll proceed in discussion format, first among the panelists and then between panelists and this wonderful audience. I'm going to first introduce the moderator of our discussion, who will be known to many in this room and to everyone on this campus. Rakesh Khurana wears an enormous number of hats here at Harvard. He is professor of sociology, Marvin Bower Professor of Leadership Development at the Business School, the Master, a role soon to be retitled, in part because of his leadership, of Cabot House, and the Dean of Harvard College. He is the author or co-author of 5 books and dozens of articles, and the winner of many awards, both for his scholarship and his teaching. His research specialties include corporate governance and leadership, and the sociological aspects of labor market economies, usually looking from the very top down, and here having a chance to talk about labor market economies from the bottom up and sideways. The activists of our panel title are a trio of sheroes, new leaders in a movement with a long history, the kind of people whose papers, hint, hint, libraries like ours will be collecting in future so that researchers like the descendants of Professor Nadasen can tell their story in decades to come. Seated next to Professor Khurana is Lydia Edwards, a movement attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services and implementation coordinator for the Massachusetts Coalition of Domestic Workers, or MCDW. Edwards was part of the legal and grassroots organizing team that wrote and successfully passed the pioneering Massachusetts Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which became law in the Commonwealth last April and for which implementation began just in the fall. With the MCDW, she coordinates grassroots efforts to implement the new law, working with domestic workers, employers, labor, state agencies, and academic institutions. She's been named one of the City of Boston's Rising Star Attorneys Under 40, thereby reminding us of her extreme youth. And the Globe profiled her in December as a Bostonian of the Year. She holds 2 law degrees, a JD from American University and an LLM from BU. She is currently running for the state Senate, which should give us all hope for the future of American politics at a moment when hope is sorely needed. Monique Nguyen Belisario, who formerly worked with Ms. Edwards at the MCDW, has been, since 2012, the executive director of Matahari, a political community dedicated to advancing the rights of and protections for women, immigrants, and domestic workers, 3 groups that often overlap in the household. A strategist and community organizer known for using technology in the service of advocacy and movement building, Monique has spoken on women's leadership and empowerment, on domestic worker rights, racial justice, and immigrant rights at campuses and events across the country. She is the recipient of many awards, including, to name just a few, the Mai Takayanagi Making Waves Award from the Asian American Resource Workshop, the Salt of the Earth Award from Community Labor United, and the Horace Selden Emerging Leader Award from Community Change Incorporated. She notes that her drive for social justice is rooted in her own personal experience as an immigrant and daughter of Vietnam War refugees who gave her a wonderful education in the conditions of the possible. Our third activist and leader at the left end of the panel here is Natalicia Tracy, Executive Director of the Brazilian Worker Center, the nation's largest Portuguese-speaking workers' rights organization. Before heading up the BWC, she worked with Edwards and Nguyen at the Massachusetts Coalition for Domestic Workers, so an incubator of both legislative change and of a new generation of leadership. In addition to her work with the MCDW's successful legislative campaign, Tracy is leading a Connecticut effort towards passage of a domestic worker civil rights bill in the past year, and she tells me that there's reason to be hopeful. She sits on the board of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, where she is vice president, and on the boards of the Women's Institute for Leadership Development, Jobs with Justice, Greater Boston Legal Services. She is also somehow, in the middle of all this, a PhD candidate in sociology at Boston University, where she has been lecturer in sociology, or she's been lecturer at sociology at UMass Boston since 2010. That's almost as many hats as Rakesh. In closing, let me circle back to Pramila Nadazan, whose work catalyzed this discussion. Dr. Nadazan is Associate Professor of History at Barnard College, where she writes, teaches on the history of race, gender, social policy, and labor. She is most interested in the historic roots of visions of social change and the ways in which poor and working class people, especially women of color, have fought for social justice. She has published extensively on multiple meanings of feminism, on alternative labor movements, and grassroots community organizing. In addition to Household Workers Unite, she is the author of the award-winning Welfare Warriors, which documents the welfare rights movement's claim to a basic minimum income in the 1960s. She is also a believer in the power of stories to change the world, and she has recovered the history of some of those world-changing stories, some of them at the Schlesinger. Please join me in welcoming her and our other guests to Radcliffe today.
So I've been asked to give a few opening remarks. And I just want to start by saying thank you to all of you for coming today. and to my co-panelists, and a special thank you to Jane Kamensky for inviting me, and I think for having the foresight to bring together this panel of scholars and activists. And finally, I want to thank all the folks at the Schlesinger Library who did work to put this panel together. Yours is the invisible labor that makes events like this happen. I want to begin by saying a few words about why this is such an opportune time to talk about household worker organizing. This is an issue that touches all of us in one way or another, and something that I've engaged with as a scholar and an activist for over a decade. The domestic workers I have come to know through observation of their campaigns, through attendance at rallies and protests, and through the sessions of legislatures where I have either attended or testified, have all been integral to my intellectual development. And that is reflected in the pages of the book. For me, it's tangible evidence that theory and praxis are inextricably intertwined. And theory emerges not only from the ivory tower, but from the lives of everyday people. And it's an example of the growing field of socially engaged scholarship. I feel enormously passionate about this subject, in part because of my own family's history and connection to this labor, but also because of the inspiration that I draw from the worker leaders around me. This preoccupation has even infected other members of my family. I vividly remember several years ago when my daughter, Indira, at the age of 6, paraded around the house with a sign that said, "Dignity for domestic workers," after I asked her to clean her room. That's not exactly the message I was trying to convey to her when I talked to her about the rights of domestic workers. But it was a poignant example of how, indeed, household labor shapes our everyday lives. Despite the importance of household labor, and this is the cooking, the cleaning, and the caring that enables each and every one of us to go to work or survive from one day to the next, this is undervalued labor. People, usually women, but not exclusively, are expected to do it without pay. In addition, this work takes place in the home, which is not usually considered a site of labor. Finally, as a paid occupation, it's performed by immigrant women or women of color, which has profoundly shaped the status of domestic workers in law and social policy. In the 1930s, when basic labor protections for workers that we think of as standard today were passed, and this is minimum wage, Social Security, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, as well as the right to organize and bargain collectively, the vast majority of domestic workers at the time were African American women. And the racial and gender politics ensured that household workers would be excluded from the realm of labor rights. In many ways, the paid household workers, those people who we hire to clean our homes and take care of our children, are outside the boundaries of legitimate labor. And their work is often unrecognized. Mainstream labor unions rarely organize to improve domestic workers' labor conditions or wages. And the common wisdom among labor organizers in the 20th century was that they were, quote unquote, unorganizable. Indeed, domestic workers are hard to organize. They are what we would call today precarious workers, an informal labor force with very little job security and with no benefits. Because they work behind closed doors, it's not always clear which households employ domestic workers, and even if we did know, their workplace would not be a strategic space for organizing, the way a factory floor is for manufacturing workers. The occupation is comprised of women of color, sometimes documented, sometimes undocumented, and English may or may not be their first language. And this is hardly the image that comes to mind when we think about the stereotypical labor organizer, but they are labor organizers indeed. So despite these assumptions and these realities, there's a very long history of domestic workers who have organized successfully and won rights for this sector. There was a national movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. 25,000, mostly African American women that I write about in my book. They had chapters all across the country, in Atlanta, in San Francisco, in Detroit, in New York, in Cleveland. Many had ties to the civil rights movement, but as I argue, perhaps their most important contribution was redefining the landscape of labor organizing. They used storytelling as a tool to organize, much like domestic workers do today. And they organized in public venues, at bus stops, or on the city buses, or in playgrounds. And in 1974, after nearly 40 years of exclusion, they won federal minimum wage protections for household workers. More recently, in the past 20 years or so, we've seen an upsurge of domestic worker organizing that has pushed for bills of rights around the country, including here in Massachusetts, that is ensuring much-needed protections for this sector. In addition, in 2011, the United Nations International Labor Organization established a convention on domestic work that set international standards for this occupation. It's now left to countries to ratify the convention. So this is an opportune time to talk about domestic worker organizing because of the way domestic workers, locally, nationally, and internationally, are standing up and fighting for their rights. And contrary to messages in novels such as The Help, domestic workers are not meek or fearful, but they are outspoken and building broad-based coalitions. We'll hear a little about some of the work that's taking place today from women who are at the forefront of this struggle. But domestic worker organizing is important not only for the individuals in this occupation, it also holds lessons for other workers laboring in a neoliberal economy. Workers today are much more likely to be independent contractors, to work intermittently or part-time, to not have health insurance or pension benefits. In short, an increasing number of American workers are experiencing the conditions under which domestic workers have labored for generations. Despite frequent laments that the labor movement is on the decline, household workers and others engaged in non-traditional labor organizing, and I would include here the Fight for 15 movement, Uber drivers, and adjunct faculty, are illustrating that there is, in fact, a growing, vibrant sector of labor organizing led by household workers. And that sector, I believe, is, through their innovative strategies, can point the way for other workers. Thank you.
Thank you. I really want to use this as an opportunity to really enable a conversation and have the opportunity to really do what Professor Madison's book says, which is to let people tell the stories and let that really be the driving force of our panel. But I have to say, I was really excited, first of all, to moderate this panel. Thank you for the invitation. And as was pointed out earlier, well, one is I've been a dean for about a year and a half, so I've really been away from my scholarship, and it was really great to sort of get an opportunity to sort of engage in such a thoughtful book. And it also gave me an opportunity to think more deeply about what I normally study, which is the tippy top of the pyramid. And at first thinking, why am I being asked to moderate this? But beginning to see the relationship actually between what I've been looking at, which is the top of the pyramid in terms of its labor markets and labor market dynamics, with what's happening at other parts and less visible parts of the labor market. In my own field of organizational behavior and sociology of work, domestic work has usually been sort of folded into parts of the larger drama and theater of social change, workplace demography or class. And in many cases, what's really interesting is that a very famous sociologist, as was pointed out in your book, Louis Koser, predicted the end of sort of domestic work, suggesting that that was sort of between technology, social change that was happening, that we would basically see the decline of it in modern society, and that it was no longer central to modern society. There was something more associated with the age of Downton Abbey than it was now. And it is interesting to see that the sort of fascination with the upstairs, downstairs aspect set back in time, but in many ways the mirroring and the remirroring of emergence of domestic work in contemporary society, especially in economies like ours where inequality has grown, to see some of the aspects that we often associated with kind of pre-industrial conditions to sort of be re-emerging. I think partly because Koester failed to predict the growth of inequality and the slowing rate of social mobility that now confronts modern post-industrial America and a neoliberal world. And I think as a result of that, a new emergence of work on the nature of contemporary society finds that domestic work has really become central and reasserted itself, as you've beautifully pointed out in the book, on labor market stratification, social movements, feminism, and globalization. I think from that, the growth in inequality, the decline of the middle class, the differential class positions of women in the division of labor between increasing what we're finding higher educated families marrying together, and how that is impacting the nature of domestic work, who performs domestic work, I think highlights really that domestic work itself as a sort of system of work can't be set apart from an interlocking system of understanding race, class, gender, and socioeconomic structure. So I think this is a really rich possibility to really talk about how a history like this really informs us of the contemporary world. I think one of the other aspects that I would just sort of emphasize before just sort of jumping into the questions is I hope we have a chance as panelists to discuss the intersections of domestic work on gender and feminism, on class, and on globalization, because I think those things can't be decoupled in many ways. And I think it's also a useful reminder that, you know, domestic work itself was originally done when you look at the, you know, sociology of it. And there has been actually maybe less written in history, but a lot written in sociology in some ways, again, partly not because I think it was explored ethnographically or narratively the way you've done so beautifully in the book, but because it just sort of was linked to the sort of stratification of labor markets, and it was often, you know, lots of debates about how should it figure into understanding the economy. Does it count as work? What is the sort of cultural system that binds it? What's the role of gender behind it? Because for most of sort of human history, domestic work's been an enduring part of the social structure. And even, you know, my understanding is that the word familia is derived from famulus, which means house servant or house slave. And so, you know, that you can't decouple all of this in any easy way. And it's historically associated with social structures which are sort of relatively immobile, confined, socially defined in very narrow ways. And as you point out in your book, I think, and as we can read about in the newspapers every day, that for many domestic workers, especially those that are sort of completely isolated and cut off, it's about as close to wage slavery as we have in sort of contemporary United States. And you know, for too many people, they still don't have even whatever minimal rights they have protected by the state in any meaningful way. And as you point out in your work, how vulnerable people are to exploitation, both historically but in many ways today. I think it's also interesting to talk about when we say domestic work, what does it mean? Because I think it has a wide range in definition. You know, for some, it might immediately sort of be thinking about defined tasks like cleaning or ironing, or, but then it gets into sort of more complex things of child rearing and shopping, and where it sort of relates to the family or the group or the household within which it's operating. And I think it becomes sort of subject to a very interesting thing about what is the nature of that relationship. Is it on that range from contractual to kind of Gemeinschaft, at least in its illusion, and you know, like that somehow has community elements. You know, where does that exist both, and how does that both feed its kind of continuation as a part of the structure? So I think this is all really like wonderfully rich. I'm hoping to hear from, you know, our panelists on these, and obviously our speaker. So I guess one question that just starts for me, I'd like to direct, and then you know, is what is the link between you know, for you personally, of this link between history and organizing, and what lessons do you think history holds for organizers especially as we see sort of shifts, and you were alluding to this, shifts in the nature of our economy, so.
Well, it's interesting, I'm a historian, obviously, but when I embarked on this project, I didn't fully understand the ways in which the African American women who I write about were invested in the history of African American women. And I learned that they actually initiated a history project in their organization to learn about the history of domestic work. And they were organizing at a very moment when the field of women's history, and the field of African American women's history in particular, was emerging as part of the discipline of history. And so they attended academic conferences, they talked about this work, they attended seminars, and they were very invested in this idea of rewriting African American women's history to include domestic workers and working class women in particular. But they also used history as a way to organize. They used history, the history of the ways in which African American women had been confined to this occupation, as a way to talk about sort of how they could imagine a different kind of freedom in the context of the civil rights movement, how African American women can begin to forge a new set of politics, a rejection of the old mammy stereotype that had identified African American women primarily as domestic workers.
Is that something for our panelists, that do you see that people using history as a way of developing a communal story, or outside of the African American experience? Monique?
Yeah, I definitely feel that history is something that we always start our stories from. Like when we talk about our story as in organizers of contemporary domestic work organizing, it always starts with, why did we get here in the first place? Because historic exclusion. And we always start with that story. And along the way, when we were doing the campaign work, we uncovered little nuggets of history that belongs as part of us too. Like whenever we discovered Melnea Cass, and Lydia can speak more to that. Melnea Cass, in the 1970s? 1970s, she helped pass domestic workers' ability to be covered under minimum wage and overtime in the state, and also the right to collectively bargain, which was amazing to us in the middle of our campaign. It really gave us life. Yeah, so that's one of the examples.
So using histories of other people's, not just of the same.
Yeah.
And in the Brazilian, do you find that, or does it relate?
Absolutely. We are always standing on the shoulders of heroes to us as we look back, even something as recent as the New York campaign, right? So we're looking at their history, their process, their struggles. How did they put that together for 6 years? And you build on that. Mm-hmm. And as Monique just said, and then you stumble on different pieces of history that it's, the 1800s or early 1900s under worse conditions, that people able to rise and succeed, so that will energize the movement further.
Yeah, please.
Just also in terms of, not just on the ground with the organizing of workers, but also with getting what would be traditional opponents to understand why this is now their moment. This is their historical moment to rectify a wrong. And that was really what we used a lot when we were talking to legislators, Republicans, Democrats alike, to say, this group has been excluded. It was an intentional exclusion to the 1930s. And it's now 2014, and someone could be fired because she's pregnant. Someone is excluded from racial discrimination under our state laws. She has no place to go. It is now our time to collectively right this wrong. So using the legal historical faults to actually rectify and make that a galvanizing cry for the actual legislators. It made them feel like a hero. It made them feel like they wanted to do something. And okay, well, this is, I've got to be part of the civil rights movement. And it was used that way as well.
No, and I think it's really interesting how the civil rights movement analogy is used by lots of movements now, and I think it's often framed. When we look at the Supreme Court on equality of marriage, for example, a lot of the use of the kind of analogies and have been akin. But I guess one question I have is that, what's the limit of using that analogy? So one thing you mentioned in your work is that in the 1960s, a lot of the women, African American women, were using it to rewrite African American history. That in fact it was a kind of dual project. One was a kind of affirmation of an invisible group, but also this intersection with academia and scholarship to sort of say there's an entire forgotten group who we have not understood, who's played a critical role in history. How much does that play for, say, our new immigrant wave of people who find themselves in domestic work? Or is it just really the civil rights component, or is it also linked to some of these other things about being seen as somebody who's the history contributes to a sense of recognition that there's a group of people, that there was individuals involved who shape the dynamics of our society. Does anybody want to take that, or or Camilla, you can? I mean, how much does that play a role? Because you described two components.
Yeah, I think that, history, the specific history of African American women, in some ways, I think, foreshadows what's happening now, and in other ways, it's a very distinct history, as you mentioned. And the legacy of slavery that African American women experienced was very prominent in their organizing. And so we hear references over and over again to the history of slavery as it shaped the lives of these domestic workers. And so when we talk about immigrant workers today, obviously the context is different, right? There isn't necessarily that same history of slavery. There may be, but not necessarily. So I think we have to think about the differences. One of the things, I guess there are a couple of things. One is the question of the lack of documentation for some of the workers today. And I think that's really important to consider. So we can think about, what is this historical moment? So in the 1960s and the 1970s, the historical moment was fundamentally about the civil rights movement and the politics of race as it affected African Americans. I think if we look at the political discourse today, it is really about the division between quote-unquote Americans and people who we consider not Americans, right? Is between the documented, the foreigners, and the domestic laborers, not domestic workers, but the folks who are U.S. citizens. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about the contemporary organizing is the ways in which labor organizers today, and it includes all these people at the table now, have been able to cross that divide and say, actually, when you talk about workers' rights, it doesn't matter if you're documented and undocumented, that in fact labor rights should be entitled to people if they're working in any setting.
Could I just ask a follow-up on that? I think there are examples of that where we talk about workers' rights as a universal, but it does seem, and Jane alluded to earlier, that within at least our society, there is a fear of undocumented workers, given the lower social mobility, given the greater economic anxiety. At least, again, I'm not an expert in politics, but it does seem at least one thing people are preying on, who are taking advantage, is trying to create divisiveness within the working class, and in particular around undocumented versus documented. And how does your work speak to that? Because I do think there is a sense of workers' rights as universal. We have the United Nations, the ILO, but unratified, and contemporary political debates, and even within union movements, some ambiguity sometimes, it feels or seems like, around how should we think about people who are have citizenship or green cards, and those who are undocumented. And maybe some of the organizers can also speak to that. Yeah.
Okay, I think I want to go back to the other question where we are talking about connecting history to the present, right? And when we talk about domestic workers then, in the past, and African Americans, we also need to remember that in the early 1900s, right? The Irish, the Polish, the Italian, these were the jobs that were available to them. In some case, those jobs were even too good for them, right? So they were also part of this history that now a lot of the workers are doing this work. They are Brazilians, they are, El Salvadorians, they are Hondurans. So the connection is there to the past. I think the difference here that Pramila brought up is the immigration status, right? So that created a great divide between, okay, you are Irish, and you had papers, right? You just had to get in line and get papers. But now there's no line. There's no line to get your papers, right? So we have a broken immigration system, and we have 11 million people, and probably about half of them are women. And I'm gonna really guess that a huge percentage of them are doing domestic work. They are undocumented, right? And many of them are afraid. Many of them don't know that they have protection under labor laws, basic protections. They have protection against retaliation. And so they are in isolation. So they are in a space where every day they get taken advantage of. Many of them are coming in not understanding any of their rights. So we deal with that on a day-to-day. And of course, we cannot forget history, because unfortunately, history constantly repeats itself. So we try to fix it so some of those really bad historical moments don't sneak up on us again and continue to, over and over again happen. So I do think that we have to, when we speak with workers, we have to draw in history. And we have to draw our own personal experiences too. And I do that all the time. I think one thing that I left out of my bio is that I was a domestic worker for 15 years. I was brought here as a domestic worker. I was in forced labor making $25 a week, working 90 hours a week for 2 years and sleeping on a 3-season porch. And I share that with the workers. That's my history. But also it's a history of many of the workers that are doing the job now and feel trapped and feel alone. So we have a responsibility to continue to have these conversations so we can correct that.
I really appreciate that, because I think having that link back to sort of the Irish and Italian and that part, especially in Boston,
Yes,
was a very
yes.
That was the jobs that were available, and given the ethnic discrimination
Yeah.
that took place, and I think just to connect what you said, I think we can't decouple this from globalization, right? Why are there huge movements of people now happening? In ways that, given the modern state, that what's leading to that? Because, there's also, in California, you can see people coming from the Pacific and the Middle East has become a place also. So I think one of the things is we can't decouple this also from the larger changes of what's happening to our economy, how we are doing immigration policy, but also how capital is flowing from one place.
I just want to say the demand too. We cannot forget the demand. There's a huge
right.
demand for the service. I mean, the country now depends on 2.5 million domestic workers every day, and by 2035, we're going to need another 4 million of them because people are turning 65 every day, and people are having babies. But all of us women, we don't want to stay home anymore and take care of the house and the children. We want to have a career. We have the right to have a career. And we find ourselves, trying to have a career and trying to take care of the family. But we're going to need some help. And we are needing some help to be able to do both and to do it well. So I think it's something that we need to remember too, is the demand. And I think was Lydia that said a long time ago that, we outsource a lot of things, but we cannot outsource our elderly, our children, or our home. Someone has to come and take care of that right here. And so therefore, the need is going to continue to increase.
If I can speak a little bit to the demand, also in connection to history, it's not just looking at, and also the connection to immigration and how they're all coming together. And a lot of the work that we do, it's dealing with modern day slavery, human trafficking, right? So domestic workers are number 2 in the country to be trafficked. And a lot of people don't know that because they're unseen and they're easily hidden. But when you can talk to an individual about, you too have gone through slavery, right? What we traditionally see as slavery being, open out there in a field and being oppressed, and you do not see even her as working, right? You often can't even see her as them being a survivor of trafficking. There are people who I've represented who didn't even know what they had gone through was what we would define legally as trafficking, and then the resources that are available, including a U or T visa. So it is looking at the connection between our own slave history and what it has become today due to globalization, due to families. Some of my clients have been brought here to work, right, for diplomats, for people who have certainly the money to pay them, and have been totally exploited and hidden away and not paid. So it's the combination of looking at immigration, looking at the globalization, looking at why people, the demand to bring people over here. Not only is it that women want to work, right, but a lot of us can't afford not to. And as we say in the movement, domestic work is the work that makes all other work possible, right? And so for many local and small mini economies within the home, the domestic worker is vital to that actual family having an income. And so when we began to talk about slavery, when we began to talk about economies, when we began to talk about, immigration, we have to talk about trafficking, and we have to talk about that as a parallel track to our fight. And it has galvanized some workers, and it helps people to really understand what they're doing and what they're part of.
Monique, do you want to add something?
No, I just it's just like a wealth of information, and I'm just trying to figure out how to even connect what we're seeing like on the larger scale, of how to translate what we're learning about these like big economic ebbs and flows of why we're even here, to even use that as a tool to organize on the most basic level. Right. And we talked about the power of stories, and then I had some students ask me earlier this week at Smith College, they were like, if there was the man, who's the man that you're fighting with on a day-to-day grind? Beyond the agencies and beyond the isolation of domestic workers and organizing them across neighborhoods, it's really the feeling that you are disenfranchised. The overall feeling like after so many decades and hundreds of years of being ignored and oppressed, that you can't do much. You can't do much to change your condition. Yeah. So the stories that we come to spaces with when, like, why am I here in this country in the first place? That's the main thing that people kind of bring to the table. That they're like, I came here because I wanted to send money home for my child. The most basic thing. Like that was the only place. U.S. is the only place that I was told that I can make money and send home to my children. And then some workers really identify with that. And other workers identify with the struggle of even making ends meet to even pay the rent, just so you can go to work the next day and have a place to sleep, So our big question as organizers, how do we connect the big level stuff with the human level connection stuff that we really need to build the movement to scale that we need. So
I love that, because and I'm going to apologize because I'm going to just keep being there, because this is where my level of analysis always comes from the structure. But thinking about how we connect structure and agency is, I think, where the possibilities for change are, because structure in my world is that human beings don't have choices. So like in sociology, everything is kind of overdetermined in a certain way. I mean, we obviously believe there's some choices, but that there's overdetermination. Your book points out that there's agency, right? There's possibility for people to organize. And you gave a mechanism, right? Which is storytelling. Storytelling somehow can mobilize something, a connection to history, that I'm not isolated, that I'm not alone. Social networks, the bus stop, these locales where sort of agency becomes possible and collectivity becomes possible, and feeling like you're part of a community and you're not just an atomistic kind of individual who's lost. But I want to because I want to explore this connection a little bit, because I think it gets to the part of your book about how do we move forward if we're not able. So just pick up on a couple of points that we're saying. You pointed to the role of gender, that in fact a lot of domestic, and I'll just, don't want to mischaracterize it, but you have situations, and it was funny what you said at the Smith, who's the man, right? But in some cases, at least what I got out of the book, is who's the woman who's employing the domestic worker, or who at least is for the lack of a better term, the manager, or the person who actually organizes their work, what needs to be done. Part of this, again, comes from opportunities that as workforce, it could be both a combination of both opportunities, which is people voluntarily going on the workforce, or out of necessity that it's hard to lead a life without having to earn income. There's a combination of both. But partly because also housework is not equally shared, right? That we know from a lot of research that while this current generation of men does more household work than their fathers did, men consistently overestimate how much they contribute to that by way off percentages from what I've learned from my colleagues in the, and from personal story. So we still have gendered division of labor in the households. And so we have this very interesting dynamic where gender and of the opportunities among a certain class of people, and there was a lot of discussion about this when Sheryl Sandberg's Leaning In came out, and like who was that a book for, and who could kind of be in that space, in that circle. So she basically was calling for agency among people, and who was left out of that discussion. And I guess I would be interested in just kind of exploring that, because on your own experiences, because it is, as we learned from the book, a gendered occupation, but also the dynamics of who is kind of organizing that work is also, I don't think we could leave recognizing the role of gender there as well.
I think, just to quickly put some comments on that, one of the, I wouldn't call it pushback, but one of the surprises we felt, I think, in talking to certain employment groups, certain women-based employment groups, was how the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights or the empowerment of nannies or house cleaners for higher wages, for overtime, was not readily embraced by professional working women, right? Not readily. It was, I wouldn't say it was a fight, but it was a surprising conversation that I had not intended to have to justify. In many cases, that you need to pay your nanny overtime, you need to pay her, you need to have a written contract. And the pushback, why? Was surprising. It was so you can go to work and so she can afford to pay her bills. But it was an irony, because I felt in some sense the very same women who would be encouraged to lean in and to break down glass ceilings in their professional capacity as doctors, as professors, as as professional women, were really struggling with, why do I can't afford, and why would I pay, and she is just, and so on and so forth, with my child. And so it was an interesting dynamics that I, in one case, the class and gender dynamic, and it was women who seemed to have the hardest point. Natalicia was instrumental in getting a lot of labor men to come on board to this movement. So it wasn't as, I don't know that the push was as hard, surprisingly, with working class men. So maybe there was a class camaraderie there. So just speaking about a little bit about the gender, at the same time, and just one more point about gender and organizing, at the very same time, while there may have been pushback, the biggest proponents, who were employers for equality and for recognition, were also women, right? Who are professional women, such as yourselves, in academic settings, or professional women who had themselves at one point been domestic workers. So, gender played in and out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to just pick up on your point, Lydia, I think household labor is simultaneously the big uniter of women across class, while it is at the same time the big divider of women across class. Because there are women who do this, I mean, lots of women do it, regardless of your class background, very often without pay, very often struggle with their husbands and spouses about who does what. But it's also the issue which obviously middle-class women, upper-class women rely on employing other women to do this work for them when they have to leave the home. So in that regard, it has the potential, I think, to build bridges among a feminist community. And in my book, I talk about how that, in fact, did happen at certain moments, especially around passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act amendment in 1974. But it also helps us understand and think about why there has been such pushback against certain sectors of the women's community. And in fact, feminism, to some degree in the 1960s, relied on hiring exploitable women to do this work, and the entire feminist project was dependent upon hiring women.
Yeah, I think that was such a fascinating part, of that story, because I think, again, this interlocking dynamic of movement, it's that you can't just look at these as simple cause and effect, right? We really have to understand how they interlock with each other and the effect. One thing, and just want to shift gears a little bit here, is, as you said, and it's come out a little bit, that storytelling connects domestic worker organizing in the 1960s, and that it still plays a role today, that you tell stories of exploitation, the stories of trafficking. It's really interesting. I have to say that, and there's a colleague of mine, Marshall Gantz, who writes a lot about the role of storytelling in the United Farm Workers, which is a kind of similar area where you had people who were really marginalized and they were not connected to any location. So in fact, it was even more complex, and also occupied this very shadow labor status. Help me understand a little bit, or why do you think storytelling is so important, and how it catalyzes agency? As a person who comes from a structural view, the idea that the epistemology of subjective experience can actually move things is a really hard connection to make. And how, or is it just a correlate that we come up with something happened and we say, oh, look at all the roles of stories in that process? And I think it would be helpful, to understand how it is. And maybe you could share a compelling story and tell us what it means to you and how it might have affected your own participation or own interest in this area.
I've always felt stories are such a great tool to break down stereotypes that people have about one another, particularly inside Mata Hari, we're a multiracial, multicultural organization. So we rely on stories to really break down the things that people assume from each other about each other in society, the messages and the cues that you get. I'll never forget this one neighborhood meeting in Lynn where there was a domestic worker who is a white woman that was making less than minimum wage, and she's been doing it for like 4 years with a family that made a lot of money. And I'll never forget our member leader, who was a Latina woman. She's like, if that can happen to a white woman, that can happen to anybody. Don't you see? That was something that was a breakthrough, because people assume that only certain groups of people are exploited, and I'm the only one. Especially when you're isolated, you're kind of like feeling that I did something wrong along the way, and this is why I'm in this situation. But when you meet other people and you see the themes and the threads, and then there's something bigger that's happening here beyond just me. And I think there's so much power because of that, using your single story to connect with other people and shared experience, and doing that to scale, it's catalyzing, it's amazing, it's powerful.
Yeah, we see a lot of that at the center as well. Storytelling is powerful because, first of all, a lot of the women, they coming in feeling uncertain and learning about that new space, what's happening, but also not understanding what everyone else is going through. And at the moment that you start telling your story, you become human again. You are vulnerable. When you open up and let people know things that happen to you, it creates a sense of vulnerability that allow other people to respect you, but also to feel that they can share you. It create human connection, and create human warmth, and create understanding that we all at one point in time in our lives, no matter who we are vulnerable. And that we need each other, and also the women, they get mad at some of the stories, and then they laugh at some of them. It's so outrageous, and then they'll cry, but then they'll tell each other that they can count on each other, and people live with the feeling that they are no longer alone. They are part of something bigger. They are not struggling alone. And I think one story I'll share with you really quickly. It was this lady, she cleaned homes, and when she first started coming to the center, she was very shy, but towards a few months later, she was helping us call the workers. She was leading some of the meeting, and then one day in one of the meetings, this lady was very upset because the employer made her clean the entire tiles in a bathroom with a toothbrush, and she told her, I think I'm really tough all the time. But one day at my workplace, I worked really hard. I finished everything. I thought my employer was going to be really excited. It was a raining afternoon and it was cold. And because I finished early, she gave me a bucket of water and said, since you finished early, I'd like you to wash the fence. And sent her out to wash the fence. She said she did wash the fence. And she said she cried the whole time as she was washing the fence. But after that day, she decided that why would she allow someone to treat her like that? And she would never allow for that to happen again. And she was telling the other workers that when things like this happen to us, it dehumanized us. It triggered us like we have no value. We can't allow it to happen. We need to work, but we also need to keep our dignity. So those kind of the conversations in those spaces where you have women who are feeling vulnerable really fill the space with hope, but also with the feeling of solidarity. So it's really powerful. And when you share stories like this with legislators, no matter how tough Republican they are, they'll stop and they'll listen and they'll support you. And they remember some of their parents who were also maids early on in the early 1900s. So that's how we're able to get a lot of the support at the State House was by telling story. I told my story 300 times. And then I brought lots of work and Monique to tell their stories too, because you also want to make sure that our story is not unique to ourselves. This is something that is happening to a very large number of people. It's a problem. It's a systemic problem that we have to correct. So that's why we tell stories, and that's why it's so important. And I think we'll continue to be as we continue to now work on, public education and implementation of the bill.
Just a note coming from a practitioner, when you're representing individuals or when you're part of organizing but also trying to explain legal concepts, storytelling is vital. No one besides a group of lawyers really cares to hear about the law. That's the truth. That's the honest to God truth. I mean, no one really cares about the excitement of changing the jurisdiction of the MCAD from 6 to 1 through the amendment that we did on blah, blah, blah. But by then, their eyes have glossed over, and by then, it's lost the point. And so instead, it was learning from, when it's organizing and working at the Brazilian Immigrant Center, working with the women from Matahari, is learning that if I cannot communicate and just talk, if I have to talk in legal terms, then I will not be heard at all. And so it was instead turning my cases that would come to me into stories. So, has anyone ever experienced a position, this situation where you were working and my client, for example, was sexually harassed? Sexually harassed, that term doesn't seem to work, right? What is sexual, what happened is she received a text message of a picture of the man's penis. That hits. And then you go into why that's wrong and the feelings that come behind it and so on and so forth. And by the way, that's illegal. Why? Because blah, 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 blah. But unfortunately, if you're a domestic worker, we can't do anything. What are you talking about? Right? And then that's a way of basically saying the MCAD does not protect gender protection because there's there's a number and there was an exclusion and so on and so forth. So it was using legal cases and experiences that were coming as part of the storytelling rubric. To explain rights, to explain where there weren't rights, and then why we had to fight.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when I think about storytelling and domestic worker organizing, it kind of reminds me a little bit about the anti-rape movement in the 1970s, where these were deeply personal, deeply tragic experiences that happened to women. And it was really only once they began to speak out and testify about their experiences that you began to see a movement evolving. And so domestic work is a very isolating occupation, and domestic workers are kind of invisible. So we have this image of what a domestic worker is. But I think the moment that individuals begin to speak out and talk about their experiences and you get to know who they are, it's the basis for developing a collective identity. And I actually think it's one of the reasons, this movement is the contemporary movement is so incredibly fascinating to me. And part of the reason it's fascinating to me is because of the ways in which they've been able to build bridges across racial and ethnic lines. And there aren't very many examples in history of a labor movement that is truly multiracial, but this one is. In nearly every city, you see workers of different ethnic groups and racial groups and linguistic backgrounds coming together to organize. I think part of the way they've been able to do that is because the stories, regardless of who you are, sound very, very similar.
It's really interesting. So there's a number of aspects that you talk about what a story is, that it seems to sort of invoke agency. It makes somebody feel like, wait, I feel some sense of empowerment because I'm able to speak and to be heard. That it creates empathy. that a shared sort of understanding and a shared experience with something that transcends to a human experience and not just, based on one, sort of certain categories of identity. Its connection to a past seems to also be, and that many people, even if they haven't had a specific experience in their families, they may have experienced pain in the past. They may have had a grandparent who had the similar role, or a parent, and then for some reason it also seems to get people who are in high power suddenly feeling, whoa. I think partly because people in power often believe that they deserve the power and they will use it righteously, and that somehow it says no, actually not all people use power righteously, and here's an opportunity for you to use your power as a legislator or your power to sort of create an even playing field for vulnerable people. I mean, this is very helpful. I guess some stories are, if not that I know anything about the structure of narrative, but I guess some stories travel better than others, and that like telling your story 300 times may have helped you figure out which parts like lead to the sort of moving people in different ways, and how you tell your story matters, and learning how to do that matters, and that's part of what education does, right? Education in some ways is a capacity to learn to tell your story in a way that transmits. You mentioned the role of contemporary, and I know we want to leave a lot of time, and I have to go teach a class at 5:30, so I'm going to be taking off. But you mentioned a little bit about contemporary organizing, and I want to ask, and it's kind of maybe not a if it's a question that's not working, just to say it. But in the beginning, you talked about contemporary organizing among, for example, seeing the $15 an hour work, the organizing consciousness that's emerging among people who increasingly find themselves in contract positions, Uber, where you're, or even UPS, where you're not considered an employee, and discussions like that. I guess one question I have is, how is technology allowing people to communicate across space and time, and how is this likely to impact organizing, whether it's through text messages or what's replaced the bus stop, or is the bus stop still the place? How do things like GroupMe, text messages, joining a user group, access to webs, the mobile technology, how is that going to play out? We've seen it at least partly contributing to social consciousness and revolutions in other places. How does it play out in social movements and organizing here, if it does?
I feel like technologies, especially for people that are not used to having access to smartphones, especially smartphones are becoming much more affordable these days. And now it becomes such a, it was once something that was a high commodity. It's something that's so accessible for people. And the power is learning how to use it for your best interests, other than having your employer call you to schedule
24/7,
something,
yeah.
and sending text messages to your family, nanny family, of pictures and whatnot. Beyond that, there's so many apps like GroupMe that help people connect, because particularly, everyone's so spread out. Not only are domestic workers working house to house to house, geographically we're spread out as well, and with extended hours of working, you don't have time to really, after a 9-hour shift or something, go to a neighborhood meeting. So we have to figure out ways to use tools for our advantage, like using GroupMe to check in with one another. And we've been using webinars, and it's been interesting because whenever we send out invites to webinar, they're like, "Where's the meeting?" Just call, just call us, and we're constantly having that issue. But technology's so amazing, because even they're making modifications to make it easier for us to even call the workers. So I've been using this tool called Uber Conference. That's no affiliation to Uber. And you can actually send something out, and it calls everybody, and everyone just gets on there like, hello, and then, and we're having a meeting, which would take us like weeks to organize, to be in person. People are late for different reasons, having trucking their children along, to having a very, succinct 1-hour meeting. We're gonna do this for this week, and talk to you guys next week, and it's been so powerful in that way. And doing it bilingually, we've been getting bigger, faster, and stronger just by, replicating and practicing it.
Yeah, I want to say that indeed, it doesn't replace though, the old-fashioned bus stop and library and stopping at the playground, but it does, it's a great, or modes of communication that speed up the process. To check in on a couple of things. If you're at your job and you have a question about something, a bill or right, you can text us and you will get the answer, right? So it does speed up the process of communication and give us absolutely other modes of accessing each other, right? But it does not. I don't think that old fashion face-to-face and hugs and getting to know each other and really listen to each other, that human interaction, we're not looking forward to, but it does enhance absolutely the work that we do.
I would say a lot of my cases I've gotten from Facebook. Whether I meant to or not, I'm just tagged all of a sudden in a question by a set of nannies. They're like, I don't know, Lydia, what do you think? And so I'm pulled into certain conversations. Actually, one of my clients, she was brought here so she's from Uganda. She worked for a family from Saudi Arabia who brought her here and then did not pay her. And so she asked to get paid many times, and I'm summarizing the story very, very quickly. Ultimately, they told her get out in the middle of January. They kicked her out of the house and put her outside, physically outside of the house, because she just wanted to be paid. And so she is outside, and she had her smartphone and luckily posted that she had been put in this situation. From that post, I don't know who found somebody went to Uganda, knew somebody in state New Jersey, who knew someone in Rhode Island, who knew someone at a shelter, who got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the shelter called me. So it was that's what it took to get her to representation and get her out and safe. But that speaks to the power of also connectedness through social media that she would not have had otherwise. So I hope, we could use that as an example to break down a lot of the isolation that survivors or people who are going through trafficking have, is that access to the internet, which we did put into the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. You can't deny them access to the phone or the computer at all. If you're the only access they have, you can't deny it to them. That's in our regulations to define what is, for privacy. And it's because of that, having access to those forms of communication, technology is freeing.
So we want to pivot to the audience. I'm going to have to apologize. I'm teaching a class in about 5 minutes at HBS. So is it okay if I switch with Jake? Thank you, and thank you so much. I apologize.